one can think of the brain in terms of these separate systems, right? That they're relatively separate from each other, and sort of understand that the mapping from a mental system, a mental domain, to the brain is kind of more or less clean or straightforward, right? So there is, let's say, prefrontal cortex is involved in abstract cognition, and visual cortex is involved in visual perception. It's doing perception, and some other part is doing some motor part, and some other part is doing some more motivational component. My idea was to sort of like, what can we do if we take away these kinds of labels that we've been using for a long time, and we look at it from a more integrative type of perspective, in which it is actually the collective joint behavior of multiple subparts that generate these complex behaviors. Maybe one way of thinking about it is that the organization that I'm proposing is not something that is one-to-one, one area to one function, but that the unit that we can think about for function is more a distributed one, that is a network of regions or a circuit that jointly generates those behaviors or supports those behaviors, so to speak. So it's not the product of a given region. It's actually something that comes about with the interaction of multiple regions. And so this is not to say that the brain doesn't have certain degrees of specialization. There are different flavors of, let's just say, computational flavors or ways of modifying information or integrating information and so on that are going to be different across brain regions. They're not saying that they're exactly the same, and that only the totality gives something that has meaning. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that there's something in between the spectrum from really super specialized at the region level, at the area level, and completely distributed across the entire brain in an amorphous sense.
Luiz Pessoa is a professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of Maryland and director of the Maryland Neuroimaging Center. He is author of 2 books, The Cognitive Emotional Brain and the more recent, The Entangled Brain. His work focuses on the use of behavior and fMRI studies to understand cognition, emotion, and motivation. Here we talk about cognition and emotion and how to conceptualize the relation between the two. We talk a bit about problems of modularity and integration in the study of neuroscience, and we touch a bit on synthetic cognitive systems and some questions that they pose. Here is my conversation with Luiz Pessoa. So maybe the best place to start off is, how did you get interested in thinking about emotions?
About emotions, I never thought that I would study anything related to emotions. It was purely chance, I think, in a way, because I was involved in some research with related to attention, brain processes of attention, and I was in a lab at NIH with Leslie Ungerleider, and also part of a larger research group with Bob Desimone. And there's a lot of thinking about attention, how attention favored the processing of certain items, and how that took place in visual cortex and interactions between prefrontal and parietal cortex with visual cortex. So I got interested a little bit in how visual stimuli with emotional content, either that being paired with let's say a mild shock, or during a certain kind of conditioning procedure, or how was studied a lot in the 1990s, just emotional faces and negative images in general, how they gain advantage and were processed more strongly to me, it resonated with lots of themes that we were studying in the attention domain. And so I kind of started by thinking in terms of just visual stimuli with emotional content, just fearful faces, angry faces, or just scenes. There's a stimulus set that is very well known, IAPS, that has pictures of accidents or pictures of mutilation or very negative images. And it was known that these kinds of images were processed more robustly, faster. They were prioritized. So I got interested in the visual processing of emotional stimuli, so to speak. And for many years, people would introduce me to a talk and say that I was doing emotion research. And I always felt that was very strange. I always felt that it was not really, I didn't feel comfortable because I wasn't an emotion researcher. And I was doing visual processing of emotional stimuli. And so things gradually went in that direction. And I started getting interested in broader themes, and gradually went into understanding the systems that people talk about in terms of cognition, emotion, motivation, and so on. So eventually I got really interested in emotion, I think, but I don't think I'm an emotion researcher in the sense of the standard type of researcher. I've kind of meander around it in some sense, so I feel comfortable with the themes, but I'm not in a sense an emotion researcher.
I know you talk about this, but emotions are often imagined as a completely different system in the brain than cognition is. But your work seems to take that in a totally different direction.
Yeah. So even from the very beginning, that's what happened. I was interested in visual stimuli with emotional content, and they had a lot of experimental psychology tasks that investigate attentional advantage or competition, and they were using these classes of stimuli, and so I started investigating it from that standpoint. From what is it about emotional stimuli that might be either driving attention, capturing attention, engaging attention, competing more effectively for limited resources, all these themes that have been studied for many, many decades in attention research. And so there's these parallel themes. And at first I was completely agnostic whether they were completely separate systems. I just basically was coming into this area, and I just I just got started from that perspective of understanding how these stimuli that people were investigating might be processed differently, because they were talking a lot about, for instance, even with visual masking, they would do experiments that they would present faces very fast, very briefly, just for 20, 30 milliseconds, and then masked with a subsequent stimulus, so that people were not even possibly, in some cases, they were not aware that they had been shown an emotional stimulus. And one of the claims was that these stimuli were evoking responses in the amygdala, for instance. So again, sort of investigating these kinds of stimuli, gradually I got into expanding, trying to understand it, and interaction or separation, for that matter, with other systems.
Right. What was this sort of an orthodox view at the time, that emotions are realized by a different system in the brain?
Yeah. So at the time, and I think to a good extent today, it doesn't take much to understand that, because if we think about it, in Western thinking, for instance, the separation between emotion and cognition goes back to the Greeks, and even in Indian thinking and the Upanishad texts, there are these themes also that are sort of parallel to the Western tradition. Or for instance, one really common theme is this one of a person either riding a chariot or a horse, and the person riding it is cognition or rationality, and the horse is emotion, right? Is this kind of this thing that you have to contain to be able to do something, because otherwise it's out of control. It's emotion. So this theme both in the West and the East, to the extent that I know a little bit, it seems to have been, in the West for sure, has been pretty dominant, this way of separating emotion and cognition. And so when people started looking into the brain, it was very natural to look at in terms of really separate domains. And in fact, if you take a psychology textbooks of experimental psychology, for instance, emotion is not in these books in the 70s and even cognitive science books in the 80s and so on. Emotion is something that is maybe some separate chapter, or sometimes most often left out and not really considered the essence of cognition, perception, and so on. It's like a separate thing. So, and I think given these long traditions of thinking, and especially in Western society, how things were separate and emotion was always viewed with suspicion, not something that can guide behavior in really intelligent and important ways that are really coupled and tuned to the environment and more from a biological evolutionary perspective. It was always viewed with quite a lot of suspicion. So the research, I think, in neuroscience maintains some of that, quite a bit of that in the beginning, and especially with human neuroscience done with the functional MRI or PET, other kinds of techniques, EEG. There's this notion that there is these separate substrates for these domains.
Right. There is this idea that emotions are automatic or precognitive in the sense, but you're finding that they're more and more modulated by our cognitive systems.
Yeah. So what I have found, and many people have found as well, is this closer interaction, and in my view, a stronger integration between these putatively separate domains. But this is really a theme in research in which there are these two strands of thinking, in which there's more of a tendency to separate, or a tendency more to put them together. I tend to put them together, to think of them as much more intertwined, interrelated than perhaps most people. But I think that the two views are ways that sort of represent research traditions in the field that exist, and I think it's fair to say that it started out more separate, and now there's more of the two views, more separated and more integrated.
Right. You point to even way back in philosophy, there's this antagonism between atomistic thinking and process philosophy, and then that has sort of through lines to the way that the fields have developed today.
Yeah. So I think that's something that when neuroscience got started in its modern era, maybe you can say something like in the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, it was really one of the dominant views was, I mean, how do we carve up this space and subdivide it in pieces that are doing different things? And from the very beginning, there were ideas of integration, of networks, of a more systems-oriented view. So I think from the very beginning, neuroscience has always had these themes of the more network integrated view and the more segregated views. And I think it's fair to say that the more separate, the more modular, separate way of thinking has been dominant. But the themes have been sort of undercurrents there throughout from the very beginning. So it's really interesting that from the modern research in neuroscience has always had a subset of investigators trying to push this idea of more collective, non-area specific, more network level, more ensemble, more distributed type of processing. and it's sort of like shifted back and forth in some sense throughout the decades, the years. So this theme is something that sort of like defines the specialization and integration, right? So it's always been very clear to neuroscientists that the brain is clearly not something that is uniform. It has a lot of structure anatomically and functionally. So there's a very clear, there's specialization. The question is the degree to which it's specialized, and in what context, in what conditions, and what are the implications, and what are the more typical, the more, what is the more dominant way of thinking has shifted, more distributed or more modular, but the themes themselves have been present throughout in some sense. So I think it's kind of a pendulum in one sense, going back and forth. And I think that, for instance, with functional MRI, there's a tendency in the very beginning, let's find working memory, let's find inhibitory control, let's find language capabilities, let's find planning, let's find attention, and so on. But not very much later than the beginning, people were looking at interactions and trying to, soon after that, looking into something like networks or systems. So again, this is sort of like the basis for neuroscience is understanding the integration and segregation of function.
Right. It's almost a knee-jerk reaction to take a modular view, but then pretty quickly networks and system thinking and distributed processing comes up.
Right. But if you think about it, the idea of breaking things down is a very natural way of looking at as how science progresses, how the activity of scientists is structured around analysis, right? It's analyzing, breaking it down into subparts and understanding the subcomponents with the view of having the possibility of then, once we know the individual parts, so it's multiple parts, of putting them together. And so scientists break things down to subcomponents to sort of like a divide and conquer type of strategy, right? So there's this really complex thing, these galaxies, and okay, let's understand maybe one individual galaxy or just planetary systems or what have you, smaller units, and put them together. And in terms of the brain, it has always been, in terms of almost from very early on, subdividing it into a number of brain regions that presumably would carry out individual separate functions. And that's a theme that, for instance, Brodmann's maps that we see in color, which if we look around the internet, they're something that some of their versions were published in the first decade of the 1900s, 1908, 1910. So it's something that is very early in neuroscience, in modern neuroscience. It has been a way of thinking that has existed from very early on.
Is there a distinction drawn between the way that we might understand the brain and then the separation of labor in studying these fields? For example, you might take an integrative view of the brain, but you might then say that we do still need distinct fields with specializations where people study specific things.
You mean in terms of having a division of labor, in terms of investigators that try to break things apart and other ones that try to look at more systemically? Or
exactly.
I think to some extent, but I think that, yeah, I think to some extent there has always been the case, but I think that mostly people have tried to break it down, right, to essentially the challenge has been, how do we break this down in terms of structure and in terms of function? So structure, some of the first attempts was like, let's take the cortex and subdivide it into 50 areas. The cortex is subdivided into 50 areas in each hemisphere, right? So Brodmann suggested around 50 areas. Others suggested more. Some suggested slightly different arrangements. But the goal is like, how do we carve this up? And if you carve something up structurally in terms of its anatomy, and it's obviously the next step is to look at physiology and see, okay, how do this structure and function are linking up? So are these 50 regions doing each one doing a separate function? Or is it some kind of other ways that we should be looking at this? Is it more across regions? How do we understand this? That's the part that has fluctuated. But I think with the center of mass towards more of like, let's look at the pieces that are brain areas. Let's look at some cortical areas. Like, let's say the amygdala has a few subnuclei, and so we study them individually and say, okay, the central amygdala does this function, the basal amygdala does this other function, the lateral amygdala does this other function. And so we're looking at more, breaking it up.
Are you excited about the fields that think in the more integrated way? So complex systems theory, dynamical systems theory, network thinking, these things have become more popular now.
Yeah, I think in the last, I think, and for sure in the first decade, right, in the 2000s, I think there's sort of like an explosion of research on network science in all sorts of scientific fields, right? And so that also led to a great amount of interest in that. And the brain was a very natural place for these kinds of tools in network science and graph theory and other kinds of complex systems theory, dynamical systems and other kinds of tools to be applied and to try to understand the brain from a more collective computation standpoint. So that's something that took off very strongly, I think, in the 2000s, together with this wave of network science. Some people, the brain is interesting because there's a strange, maybe not strange is not the exact word, but this really interesting history of neuroscience, because from the 1940s, McCulloch and Pitts and many others suggest artificial computational neural networks as one mechanism to understand computation, and computation in the brain or more generally. And so from very early, there were artificial neural networks, right? So people were doing research in artificial neural networks in the 50s and the 60s. This was quite small compared, obviously, to something like today. But that existed, and that proceeded in parallel with the work that neuroscientists were doing. Neuroscientists were doing it and often not really paying attention to this other side of things. They were experimentalists, so they were a very different way of thinking. They were really tied to biological thinking and how one has a given training in biology and neuroscience. Actually, neuroscience as a discipline itself, as a modern discipline with departments and other kinds, let's say with an international conference, is something from the very late 60s or early 70s. So it's something that existed, a way of thinking that was more in terms of artificial neural networks. And that view didn't influence so much experimental work, but it was always there in the background. People were kind of like aware of it to some extent and maybe influenced a little bit. And obviously there was a huge wave of research in artificial neural networks called connectionism and parallel distributed processing, with the really popular book by McClellan and Romohart and others with the PDP, so-called PDP group, that had a huge impact in neuroscience in the mid to late 80s and into the 90s. So, science is this really interesting thing because there's all these styles of thinking that coexist, and sort of sometimes they don't talk to each other too much, sometimes they do, but there's almost a little bit also these kinds of cultural, you're immersed in a certain culture that some of these ideas permeate a little bit and fluctuate from one direction to the other, informing the artificial neural network side and informing the biological brain neuroscience community. And so these kinds of ideas flowing in the air somehow and cross influencing each other.
Right. That's an interesting idea, that there doesn't have to be a direct link between, say, McClellan bits to the PDP model, but it's just the sort of collective culture that's created by these ideas.
Yeah, so there are these cultures, exactly, right? There are these cultures. These cultures, for many decades, they were quite isolated. And so for the artificial neural networks culture was quite isolated. In the 70s, there was relatively small number of investigators compared to certainly the 80s, mid 80s and later. So these cultures exist, and they're kind of influencing a few investigators and a few neuroscientists that take up some of these themes and ideas, but in ways that are difficult to pin down, and the flow of knowledge is kind of like this sort of mysterious thing that how it might influence some people. And so for instance, there's a very well known there's a really important paper in the Annual Review of Neuroscience by Patricia Goldman Rakesh. I think it's from 1988, a review paper that talks about the brain in terms of parallel distributed computing, and showing how, for instance, she was really a giant in neuroscience that did a lot of really groundbreaking work in anatomy, but then did quite a lot of work in physiology as well, and even functional MRI at one point, I think, and the work that was described, it was looking at frontoparietal networks as these distributed systems. And so it really has like amazing, even sort of like the images, the pictures in the papers are sort of classic, because it really has these regions linked up across parietal and frontal cortex and the lateral surface and the medial surface, and thinking about in terms of these parallel distributed systems in ways that were very innovative for traditional neuroanatomy, but made a really strong connection with PDP style thinking. And I'm almost sure, I read this a few times in quite a while ago, but I'm almost sure that these papers are, that the PDP type of idea is described briefly in I think there are citations to these papers, because I think that these ideas, again, people were exchanging some of these ideas at the time.
Right. On that end, it seems like there's still a strong antagonism between people who look at a more computational view of the brain versus people who are more biologically grounded.
Yeah, there's a very, very strong different communities there for sure. Some people are very skeptical because, the world of computational neuroscience is a little bit like physics or physics applied to neuroscience also. One has to greatly simplify, right? So, sometimes biologists are the ones that love the richness, the amazing complexity and the details of things. And then if you take all of that complexity and you put one node is here, and it represents this whole constellation of a lot of very heterogeneous things, then the biologists can get really uncomfortable, right? And so that skill, that way of mode of thinking that a physicist, what's the simplest way that I can think of this? Oh, it's some kind of, let's think it of as a perfect sphere, or let's think, of something that's all symmetric and the connections are symmetrical. And as the neuroscientists know, but we know that the connection from A to B is one strength and the B to A is another strength. And so the simplifications that are really important for computational models, let's say like a Hopfield model from the 80s, that was one of the ideas, is that the connectivity matrix is symmetric, and it had really important computational properties that required that symmetry in the weight matrix. But the brain is not symmetric in its connectivity matrix. So the first thing is like, okay, this is not super useful because it deviates too much. Or maybe it is really super useful because it captures some really essential way of thinking, attractor states or some other mode of computation, content addressable memories and other kinds of properties that Hopfield and other kinds of related networks have, that at least in the very beginning required some of these really extreme assumptions, and that these have been to some extent more recently relaxed to some extent to understand the extent to which they're required or not. But yeah, so there are very different cultures, very different levels of comfort or wanting to stay close to details versus the big picture in simplifying ways.
Well, what do you think of the idea there? Even though we just stressed the complexity, to ask a very simplified question, what do you think of that? Is everything the brain does, is it computable, and then can it be realized in a synthetic system that isn't biological?
I think the way that you're formulating it is a little too broad, because if you think about it in terms of, for instance, if we think about putting in terms of dynamical systems, right? So we can simulate in computers, we can simulate very, very, very broad classes of dynamical systems. And these dynamical systems, if you can write them at the outset with a set of differential equations and let them evolve, then they can generate very complex behaviors. And so there's if you leave it as flexible as that you can implement it almost arbitrarily in whatever way you want, I think it's maybe too open-ended, right? So in a sense, it's too open-ended. But what you might have in mind, certain more structured ways of computing that have certain parallels that are a little bit closer to how a computer might have a set of instructions with a set of principles that you have certain states, and then you proceed to different states based on basic rules, right? Like in a finite state machine, or in some, let's say, like Turing type of way of thinking about computation. So I think it sort of spans too broadly for us to even have. I think that sometimes this debate gets a little bit, we get lost a little bit in the sense that there's just too many ways in which we can think about what is computation and what is computable. And there are many ways in which we can formalize exactly what we want to say with that. But unless we do that, then the brain can be a computational device of so many different kinds that is not really helping constrain the debate, I think. Because it might be something like, for instance, very close to some computer architecture, or it might be some kind of very complex dynamical system that you could study that dynamical system, assuming that it has relatively fixed rules, or let's say set of equations, that these equations themselves are not completely themselves evolving in some really complex way, because we usually assume that these dynamical systems, as described, let's say, with a set of differential equations, are relatively fixed, right? And in the sense of that the equations themselves are fixed. The system itself evolves dynamically, but the equations that determine the dynamics are relatively fixed, right? So I think that there's such different styles of computation in those that sometimes I get lost in, like, what do we exactly mean by you can compute things, or to me, I think it's more interesting to understand what computational flavor it might have. So if you feel a certain computational, so basically what kind of architecture does it have? It basically has these kinds of certain kinds of states, states that are transitioning in some way, or it has certain kinds of other kinds of dynamics. How do we envision it to be? What kind of architecture and system is it? Is it an arbitrary, like an arbitrary deep neural network type of architecture that is just mapping inputs to outputs? Or is it something that has many other constraints in which the way the organ is organized that, yes, it can be simulated in a computer, but it's just that this computer formalism is flexible enough that it allows us to simulate a very, very large class of architectures and systems.
Right. Is it an intelligible question to ask that, well, you can have all these different types of computational architectures, but is there some sort of base architecture that they're reducible to? So a Turing machine or a finite state. Can they ultimately be reduced and implemented in that kind of a system, and then you can have classes and
Yeah, I think we can. I it's a little bit like function approximation, right? So you can have these. So suppose you're interested in some set of mappings from input to output. So if you define some class of system, a neural network or some other kind of system or function approximation that has arbitrarily can approximate input output functions with enough data and so on, then we basically have too much of a range. So I think that the issue is like what constrains the architectures that we're interested in, right? So for instance, you can have if you think of the goal of just producing some product that you want to, can have as many layers as I want, as many units as I have, as many parameters as I want. I can have 1 trillion parameters. I can have whatever. Then you kind of unconstrained, right? So you can do too many ways of you basically you can build it in just too many ways. So the way I'm interested in is what is the way that, just to narrow it down a little bit, like how do vertebrate brains with this specific kind of architecture, with these kinds of connections, these types of cells, cell types, these types of neurotransmitter or other kinds of communication processing, ways of affecting different parts of the system. So if you take all these elements, then what are the kinds of things that this system can do, right? So what are the kinds of things that you can build with those systems that arise more naturally, right? So I think that's a little bit this debate whether what can you do with an artificial system. It's a little bit unconstrained if you have infinite resources, or infinite in quotes, obviously, like you can, spend $5 billion to get all the computational resources of an entire city to train 1 quadrillion parameters. And then it becomes a really cool input-output mapper, such that it feels that it can do lots of really complex things. And because it was fed on all the knowledge that we've generated in the past 30 years in the internet, and it can generate things that are pretty remarkable. But is that something that the brain is doing?
Right. These two things can be separate questions, like the question of the scientific analysis of how the brain works, and then using generalizations from there to build synthetic systems that might then do interesting things, but then that doesn't mean that there's some sort of identity equivalency between the biological system and the synthetic system.
Yeah, that summarizes how I think. I think that you can be inspired by it, or maybe not. Let's say you're a pure mathematician, just try to understand certain kinds of classes of algorithms. A computer science mathematician, physicist, trying to understand some property of the system, and you may or may not be inspired in natural systems. So I sometimes I think we're jumping too much onto how is this happening in the brain, which is a fantastic question if you're a neuroscientist, but not everyone wants to be a neuroscientist. That's fine, right? So if you're an engineer, you might not even care about it. Okay, I don't care too much about the brain. That's fine. But so it could be that certain kinds of biological systems, have solved the problem of intelligence in the sense of being animals that survive and consistently have in certain habitats and so on. And we don't have that yet for artificial systems, right? So we don't have it. We can put some autonomous agent that is completely artificial in some kind of environment and have it survive, right? So you may or may not be inspired by that, but I think that you just can come up with very different kinds of solutions that will not inform each other so much. I mean, that's my hunch. Other people feel that once you get certain properties, you sort of get some essence of how some other architectures have arrived at those properties too. I think that's going to be an empirical question. I think that it's not clear to me that it has to be. I mean, it could be, and my gut feeling for not very a great thing to base anything on one's gut feeling, but is that you could get very different kinds of systems that get at solutions in different ways, and so it's not going to be very informative if you want to go one way or the other.
Right. I think what you said about having it be an empirical question is very important, and then throwing integration into the mix makes things even more challenging.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So just to step back, I probably should have asked this much earlier, but do you mind stating for the audience the core thesis of the entangled brain?
Yeah. So in the entangled brain, the idea that I had was to write a book to a general audience that, in a sense, it would just present the brain in a way that is, it's not completely, and there's no claim that this is completely a novel way of thinking about the brain, but the idea is putting all these elements in a short book for the general audience to have a certain appreciation of how we can view the brain through the lens of more like a complex system, right? Not through the standpoint of a more traditional way of looking at the brain in terms of individual areas that have well-defined functions, and these well-defined functions sort of combine in a rather linear way to generate a broader set of complex behaviors. So the idea was to challenge that a little bit and propose that to understand how the brain supports complex behaviors, we sort of need to understand it from a more integration standpoint. By integration, I mean there are these multiple systems in the brain that one can think. Let me step back. One can think of the brain in terms of these separate systems, right? That they're relatively separate from each other, and sort of understand that the mapping from a mental system, a mental domain, to the brain is kind of more or less clean or straightforward, right? So there is, let's say, prefrontal cortex is involved in abstract cognition. And visual cortex is involved in visual perception. It's doing perception, and some other part is doing some motor part, and some other part is doing some more motivational component. My idea was to sort of like, what can we do if we take away these kinds of labels that we've been using for a long time, and we look at it from a more integrative type of perspective, in which it is actually the collective joint behavior of multiple subparts that generate these complex behaviors. So, for instance, so the first implication, maybe one way of thinking about it is that the organization that I'm proposing is not something that is one-to-one, one area to one function, but that the unit that we can think about for function is more a distributed one that is a network of regions or a circuit that jointly generates those behaviors or supports those behaviors, so to speak. So it's not the product of a given region. It's actually something that comes about with the interaction of multiple regions. And so this is not to say that the brain doesn't have certain degrees of specialization. There are different flavors of, let's just say, computational flavors or ways of modifying information or integrating information and so on that are going to be different across brain regions. They're not saying that they're exactly the same, and that only the totality gives something that has meaning. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that there's something in between the spectrum from really super specialized at the region level, at the area level, and completely distributed across the entire brain in an amorphous sense. So what it was being said is something that is relatively uncontroversial. It's just that it pushes towards themes of distributed parallel computation that highlight that aspect of the function of the system more so than the local type of processing that sometimes is emphasized. So it's in a way, it's more trying to understand it in terms of a highly context-dependent system with the functions being more emergent. They emerge via the interactions across a larger set of brain regions. So essentially, functions are functions of multiple regions, and instead of being something that is more carried out at an individual region. But there's an important difference there, which is every neuroscience would say that, of course, areas combine to generate something more complex. So this is sort of something that I think that would be very general agreement. But what I'm trying to say is that the emergent properties of these circuits or networks is they have properties that are not trivially mappable to the individual regions. It's more truly some collective computation. So imagine, for instance, let's say one is in some kind of in a car, in an automobile, on a bus, or whatever. So there are properties that only arise with certain kind of traffic configurations. Let's say you're like some kind of very high speed highway, and everyone is going at very high speed. But there are certain kinds of events that can happen that are collective properties of this system. So, for instance, let's say a mile or 2 miles ahead of me, there's a car accident, or there's almost a car accident, and there's some kind of slowing down, and this slowing down kind of trickles back in the traffic stream all the way back in a way that imposes changes to the way that the individual cars are driving. All of a sudden, everyone has to kind of go really slow, and there are these waves in traffic that speed up and slow down, sort of like these kind of collective properties that are really properties that are collective properties. They're not properties that are inherent in the driving of a car, on the individual car, but it's something that sort of emerges from the traffic dynamic. And so that's one example that that's obviously far from perfect, because all the cars are more or less the same and whatnot. So it's kind of artificial, but it's just to highlight that the properties that we are interested have to do with, again, these collective properties. And so when one thinks about, let's say, one thinks about how sometimes the brain is functioning in a way that can be associated with mental health issues, like, let's say, anxiety, or or depression or something like that. So sometimes the impulse is to think that there's a specific part of the brain that is malfunctioning, let's say the amygdala, right? So the amygdala signals too strongly fear or something related to danger, and I overreact, and so I become, my anxiety is something that is you can almost point to it, right? It's in the amygdala. It's the amygdala malfunction or dysfunction or different function. So what I'm trying to suggest is that these components, such as the amygdala and anxiety, they are important, but to understand the whole realm of ways in which having anxiety changes how I perceive the world, how I think about the world, how I react about in the world, you have to really consider how the amygdala is interacting with visual cortex, with other systems in frontal and parietal cortex, with motivational systems, with other kinds of systems, to understand it at a much more, again, distributed sense. It's not something that is easily localizable. It's not just the amygdala signaling something and changing how you do it, but it's the amygdala functioning together with these other components that will manifest in ways that we observe, let's say, in depression or anxiety. That's, I'm not a clinical psychologist or a clinical researcher, but that's the way that I try to conceptualize these kinds of ways in which the system might generate something, might be associated with something like anxiety or depression, in a way that is something that is, it's not just limited to one aspect or one facet of processing, that there is a dysfunctional system here, there's a dysfunctional region here that is responding more strongly, and therefore, sort of, if I tamp it down, then you kind of reestablish the overall equilibrium. So it's much more of how the system is interacting across a wide range of systems. It's one component of multiple systems that sort of overlap. And so when we take that part and we look at how it contributes to these multiple functions, then we can have a little bit better understanding of why it manifests in so many different ways. So that's one way. That's one way of thinking that I sort of like this entangled brain suggestion is that decomposing things and separating things is not something that is not how the brain is organized.
So when we talk about the emergent effects of networks that then correspond to the function that correspond to the complex behavior, do we mean that in sort of an explanatory way? We're talking about you're talking about it in a way that's helpful for the conceptual taxonomy, or do we mean that more causally, in that is the network doing is the emergent effect of the network doing some causal work that isn't reducible to the lower level substrate?
Yeah, so the issue of causation is really a mess, right? Because if you take so I mean, I think the easiest way to think about causation is sort of like in a Newtonian sort of billiard ball type of scheme, right? So you have one ball, it hits the other one, and it transfers energy, and it kind of, the other one moves. In a similar way, you can say that there's one brain area that excites another brain area. So literally, there's something physically in that coupling between the two regions, right? And so, but the minute that you have a system that has an enormous amount of bidirectional connections, multiple layers and spiraling loops, in cortex and subcortex, and cortex, thalamus, and then cerebellum, and basal ganglia, and midbrain, and so on and so forth. I think this billiard ball scheme sort of breaks down because there's this strong coupling and interdependence between the regions that makes the causal way of thinking, I think, problematic. I shouldn't say that. Let me say it slightly differently. So the causation needs to be sort of reconceptualized to be something that is not this straightforward causation of a chain of events that you can kind of neatly uncouple from each other. It's really something, and the narrative has to be something quite different now, because the interdependence is sort of, there's the circularity, right? So the system has feedback, and a system that has feedback then cause and effect becoming quite much more tricky to even conceptualize and to describe. And so your original question was in terms of so tell me again, what was the original question?
No, it was just that. Is that did you mean emergence causally, or do you mean exponentially?
I mean causally, but obviously one has to be careful there, because the issue of causation and coupled with the issue of emergence can easily get into all sorts of traps, right? In the sense of, for instance, does the system... So what is really causation? If causation is really just the transfer of energy in a very straightforward way, right? That many times we think it's literally a collision, or is a propagation of a signal, or is something that literally is mechanical, right? That literally bends or pushes. There's a very natural way of thinking about that. And so when you have some macroscopic organization of a system that constrains the functions of the parts, then one of the sort of mysteries in that whole thing, in emergent behaviors, is that how does that not violate some basic principles of closure and that a physical system, it just... You can't introduce something if something is already... You can't basically just add energy, or it just basically... The way to think about it, I think, is, like several people have proposed in the past, is in terms of constraints, right? So the organization of the system constrains the way that the parts can function. So what I mean by that? So again, if you go back to the traffic example, if one doesn't want to have a collision, you have to monitor your traffic flow very carefully, so that you accelerate or brake, so that you maintain distance and other kinds of acceptable relationships in traffic, right? So in a sense, the initial event that, let's say there was some initial event that there's some kind of accident a few miles ahead that literally caused 3 lanes or 2 lanes out of 4 lanes to be blocked physically, right? So there's something that happened there. But in a sense, it's a different form of causation. It's a form of causation in which the overall configuration of the system constrains the paths that the individual components can take. So once the amygdala is interacting heavily with visual cortex in certain ways, and these regions are interacting with others, in what ways does this constrain the function of other regions, right? So that's sort of like the open question that I have in my mind, is that, can we apply this kind of reasoning that the general pattern is something that constrains the ways in which other regions can be engaged in a way that is causal in this sense, not in the sense that the more straightforward causation, which is sort of like something is pushing you, something is pulling you, and bending and so on. That is the more straightforward version of causation, which doesn't allow for the system itself feedback on the individual parts, because the causal flow has already been used up, right? So you can't basically say you can't use it twice, so to speak, right? Because otherwise you're kind of violating conservation of energy or some other kind of principle. But if you think of temporal dynamics, if things are evolving temporally and it's not completely simultaneously, and obviously it's not completely simultaneously, then things don't seem to be violated, right? Because it's the overall configuration that's going to affect you at a later point in time. So it's not simultaneously that the entire system is constraining you, but there's a temporal flow in a way that actually makes emergence a little bit more easier to digest, because it's something that has to do with the temporal evolution of the system going through multiple states and having a current state being dependent on, let's say, the previous state or previous past 2-3 states, in a way that doesn't seem as spooky, right? That all of a sudden the system itself is exerting an impact on its parts, but how can that happen in a way that doesn't have any transfer of energy if it's just going in one direction?
Right. The individual neurons aren't doing anything that's violating the laws of physics.
Yeah, so I obviously we have to stay within that, right? No one is saying that there's any mysterious thing going on in that sense. It's going to be all based on meeting all those criteria, because otherwise we're not going to go anywhere. It's not to say anything that goes beyond, beyond standard physics.
So taking a step back to emotions and attention, where we started off, do you mind just walking through some of the work there that shows this?
Yeah, so attention is many things, right? But one way that we can think about attention is something that helps select information or guide action, let's say. And one way that we can think about it is that visual processing, for instance, is influenced by attention, whatever we mean exactly by that. But we can say, for instance, that the objects that are behaviorally relevant, they receive some kind of extra boost somehow that perhaps is provided by other brain areas like frontal cortex, parietal cortex, that might allow those items in the visual cortex to be processed in some enhanced fashion that allows my reaction to them or my detection of them to be, they're faster, they're more efficient, right? So the selection of information is favored for items that are task relevant, and I'm trying to attend to certain kinds of information, or sometimes other kinds of information that are inherently more attention grabbing. Like there's a very loud sound here, and all of a sudden that captures my attention, and that kind of information is favored compared to other kinds of information. So what people found is that emotional stimuli seem to have these kinds of properties. Emotional stimuli, they compete more strongly relative to non-emotional stimuli. They compete more strongly so that they sort of have these properties that we attribute to attention. I detect them faster. It's more reliable. I have increased accuracy. They have effects in further processing more strongly than neutral items. So the question is, how do these effects come about? And so much of this literature has tried to understand, for instance, the ways in which the amygdala is providing this competitive advantage for emotional items. And there's quite a bit of evidence suggesting that is, in fact, the amygdala does provide that. For instance, individuals that have amygdala lesions, then this advantage is decreased, and the increased responses that emotional visual stimuli have in visual cortex is not observed in individuals that have amygdala lesions. And in fact, there are some also primate studies, lesion studies, in which the amygdala is lesion, and finding these kinds of effects have been altered in the animals that have lesions. And so it became very, very sort of like a standard way of explaining this, as there's a specialized region, the amygdala, that sort of confers this advantage to emotional stimuli. And again, there is evidence for that. So one of the things that and that's something that has been well established. But one of the things that we have also emphasized is that together with these mechanisms, they're not the only mechanism that is sort of conferring the advantage to the visual processing that these emotional items. So one possibility is that there's the impact of the amygdala directly in visual cortex, because there are projections from the amygdala to visual cortex that would provide an anatomical substrate for that advantage. But there are many other ways in which the system also could be working. For instance, the amygdala could be working together with frontal and parietal cortex, and frontal and parietal cortex could, by their turn, be having an impact on visual processing. So neutral information that is task relevant, for instance, that I'm trying to find a friend. It's very crowded here, but they said that they would be wearing some red hat or something. So I'm looking for a hat and red and so on. So one of the ideas is that frontal and parietal cortex really help guide this visual search, this search process, and allows me to detect my friend with the red hat in this crowded scene. So this has been, in general, described for neutral information, for information that is not something that is explicitly linked to some emotional content. Even though it's hard to separate things, right? Because it's my friend, and my friend has some motivational affective significance, but that's a different conversation. So, but what we find is that in many cases, these other circuits are also engaged together with the amygdala. So the amygdala might be providing. So I guess what I want to say is that the amygdala might be providing this competitive advantage for emotional information, but it is also it's also working together. That's a working hypothesis. That is, and there is some evidence that is compatible with that view. It's also working together with frontal and parietal cortex, which by their turn are helping the selection of information in the visual cortex. So at that point, should we say that the connection from the connection from the amygdala to visual cortex is emotion, and the connection from the amygdala linking up with frontal parietal cortex and the impact that frontal parietal cortex have on visual perception, is that part cognition? So you see, the way I view the system is much more interlinked and interlocked, that describing and putting these labels as, okay, this is an emotional component, this one is a cognitive component, and this one is a cognitive emotional component, we could say, right? Because the amygdala is kind of, so, and this other component maybe is, okay, this friend, or in some kind of situation, these kinds of effects have been shown with information that is paired with reward. So this friend, searching for this friend is a positive stimulus for me because, I had rewarding past experiences with this friend. And so should we look at the effect, the advantage of positive information that I'm looking at that has also these attention-like effects as something that is motivation and reward? Or is it attention because it involves frontoparietal regions? Or is it reward? If I found a connection from, let's say, the ventral striatum, this connection doesn't exist. But let's say there is a connection from the ventral striatum to visual cortex. It doesn't exist, but if it existed, would that be reward and motivation? But because it goes via cortex, and now it's motivation engaging cognition that engages perception, I think that's one type of language that one can adopt. And I don't have necessarily a problem with that language. What I have a problem is that when we try to really push them apart and de-emphasize their interactions, because all these behaviors are effective and motivational, and motivated, I should say, because behaviors, if we're not motivated, we don't act. We just would sit here and do nothing if there's absolutely no motivating, nothing is motivating us. You're not motivated to perform this interview. I'm not motivated to be part of the interview. So we need something that is driving, motivating us to action, right? And the items in the world, even though they're not hugely charged necessarily, unless there's more extreme situations with emotional and motivational content, they're always embedded in some kind of context that is motivational and effective. And so, okay, maybe that advantage is a little lower than, it's not something that you paired with shock and you paired with lots of reward that we do in an experiment. It's not like that. But at the same time, to completely extricate from them affective and emotional content also seems artificial to me. And so it is possible to separate these things and describe it in terms of, this is a motivational contribution, this is an emotional contribution in the amygdala, this is a cognitive contribution in frontoparietal cortex. But I find it more useful to not get completely tied down by these labels and try to understand the behavior itself. What is the behavior itself? The behavior itself is that I'm trying to find my friend that has a red hat, or the animal is doing some kind of behavior, some foraging behavior, some approach, withdrawal, whatever behavior that has some behavioral significance given the life of the animal. And so it is possible to describe it that this stage of the behavior is more cognitive and this stage is more emotional. If you want to label it in some fashion, I don't think it's problematic to do that. But I don't think we gain a whole lot, because behaviors don't come with these subcomponents that are individualized. They're sort of mixed, right? And okay, you could say humans are a little bit different because, I don't know, we can play chess and do all sorts of things, or derive some theorem here that it's a cognitive operation. And sure, I think that you can call that cognitive, but again, no one would play chess if they didn't want to beat the opponent, because they would not beat the opponent if they didn't want to beat the opponent, right? Because why would they even sit there for hours and play, or spend weeks in a theorem trying to understand? There's something kind of that has to have some motivational, that drives you to work, right? Whatever drives you to work, we can call it motivation. And there has to be something. Otherwise, we just look up and just do nothing, right? We just don't act in the world.
Right. It becomes a problem at, say, a folk psychological level when we try to separate out emotions and rationality or something, and then we privilege one or the other.
Yeah, I don't find that useful anymore. I think I think conceivably there are some examples, some instances you might want to do that, but I struggle with when that would be very useful. But I do recognize that my tendency has been to push the other side because our tendency to break things down, and my tendency has been to kind of, let's try to put the the components together and see how out of the coordination certain kind of interesting behavior arises. Because if we're a psychologist, or if we're a neuroscientist, or if we're cognitive scientists, we want to presumably we want to explain complex behaviors, or not behaviors necessarily restricted to, I move here. It could be mental capabilities, or could be all sorts of much more abstract or broader range of things, not behavior in the sense of, I'm going to move this thing to this other side here, so I have some behavior. But I think that in trying to explain these mental capabilities and these complex behaviors that people might engage in, I prefer to look at these interactions and how they're interdependent, and not break them down.
Okay, so final question. What role do you find philosophy to play, if you find philosophy to be helpful? So I'm pointing to the Neuroscience and Philosophy Salon, which makes excellent videos here on YouTube that everyone should check out.
Oh, great. You like it. Yeah. Well, I think I don't know exactly why do we like certain things, right? I mean, we don't know why we like certain things as opposed to other things, but I was always interested in foundational things, in foundational aspects of anything. And so I a few years ago, and in fact, as I was writing the Entangled Brain, the book, I really felt that we were not, as a field, we're so busy doing things because our lives are just really busy in the sense of you have to run experiments and you have to get results so you can publish, and then you can write grants. And if you don't write the grants, you don't have the money to run the experiments. And I always felt that there's this kind of strange thing that some colleagues sometimes told me. I've heard several colleagues tell me this, that they would love when they either write a review paper, or sometimes even more counterintuitively and kind of sometimes very strange, when they were writing a grant, because they had to kind of step back and think more broadly and maybe develop some framework, or look at the literature more broadly, something that even though we're doing science, we're so busy, but we don't have the time to do as much as we would like to, and as much as we thought we would when we got into science in the first place, because that's what we got attracted us to science, was to be able to maybe think about these things. So basically, the philosophy side of things has been one way that I have felt, one aspect that I have felt is not sufficiently emphasized in neuroscience, in terms of thinking about the foundations of our field: psychology, cognitive science, neuroscience, the mind, the brain, the body, the environment, all these things. How do these things go together in a more foundational sense, that we can think in more abstract terms, in more conceptual terms, in more theoretical terms, and try to see how that cross-fertilizes to the things that we do in our lives when we have to do the actual day-to-day experiments. How do they inform each other? So issues like we've talked about, several of them, these issues of causation or emergence, or not to mention many other issues that related to consciousness, related to embodiment, or related to the coupling between organism and environment. And there's so many dimensions that are left to, that's what philosophers do, or it just kind of either it has this negative connotation too as a speculation. Sure, I mean, it can be done in some speculative way, but good philosophy or good conceptual work, theoretical work, will try to really make a much stronger connection with the actual, I hope, with the actual work, so that these bridges will be real, as opposed to, oh, I'm just speculating about consciousness, or I'm just speculating about dynamical systems in the brain, or computation in the brain, or analog computation. Obviously you can do it completely detached from everything else, but I think there are so many avenues in which they can inform each other that I'm really attracted to seeing ways in which they can help. And because neuroscientists are so busy in terms of just pushing ourselves a little bit to think more conceptually and examine some of the foundations, I think it's really important, really useful. And it's a little bit similar to also understanding. And once we do that, it's very natural to also think about the history of our field, the history of the ideas. Why do we think about emotion in this way today? Why do we think about evolution in certain ways? Evolution in terms of adding systems on top of existing systems. Is there a reason why we think about that in that way versus some other way of conceptualizing brain evolution? And it turns out that there are many ways. There are many reasons why we have inherited certain modes of thinking that have to do with as much with data than anything else, as concepts. The concepts that we've had in time a century ago, 2 centuries ago, 50 years ago, and understanding and revisiting that, I think is hugely useful. So the hope is that it can be fun, and it can help a little bit try to discuss these foundational issues. And so that's a little bit what led to trying to create this neuroscience and philosophy salon. And it's very improvised, and whenever I have a little bit of time and trying to gather a group of people that would be interested in the discussion, because people are very busy. And so, can people be in another certain online event, and do they have time to to join some other event? But at least now having these videos archived allows people to go back and maybe check them later. So I think that really changes things quite a lot. I mean, it's a very simple thing, but they're available. So there were 20, 30, 40, 50 people at the session, but then 1,000 people have access to it, which I think it's great to know that they can generate that amount of interest.
Yeah, well, they've certainly been very helpful to me.
Oh, yeah, great.
Well, that seems like as great a place as any to end off. Do you have anything that you would like to sound off on?
No, I think it's good. I just do we encourage people to, I think, to not view brain science as or let's say neuroscience and psychology as just through one lens, but be more open to multiple ways of looking at the system. So when I talk about distributed systems, it's one inclination that I have, but you also have to have in mind that something that doesn't get emphasized enough. All these issues are empirical issues. If we find that looking at the system through a really strongly modular way is hugely valuable and explains things much better, that's what we should do. I mean, it's really something that we have to stay close to the data, right? And obviously, data don't constrain theories as much as we would like, because we're studying very complex domains, and so there's this feeling that unfortunately they don't constrain things as much as we would like. It's not something that we have some kind of physics theory that predicts that you can pile up 8 atoms but not 9 or something, so it's otherwise we can't do these predictions at that kind of level and to the 15th decimal point of precision. But that's not to say that everything goes. We want to stay and promote something that provides explanatory power. And now that we have recordings and ways of looking at the brain that measure lots of regions simultaneously, lots of neurons simultaneously. I think it's a good time to look to the extent to which some of these ideas are useful. And if they turn out not to be very useful, then, it's time to admit that there are other ways of looking at that are more profitable.